What if the oldest stories ever written by humanity were not myths, but eyewitness accounts? Not metaphors, not religious symbolism, not primitive attempts to explain lightning or war, but records of technology so advanced that ancient people had no language to describe them except the language of gods. Across Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of clay tablets buried beneath collapsed temples and ruined cities. Most contain taxes, trade records, hymns, and royal decrees. But scattered among them are texts that describe something else entirely. Weapons that emitted invisible force, devices that burned cities without fire, machines that flew through the sky with thunder beneath them. And beings called the Anunnaki, entities the Sumerians claimed descended from the heavens long before the first kings ruled Earth. The strange part is not that these stories exist. The strange part is how technically specific many of them are. Descriptions of heat intense enough to melt stone, invisible sickness spreading after battle, shockwaves, poisoned rivers, blinding flashes, cities abandoned overnight, even references to protective garments and sealed chambers after catastrophic events. And when modern researchers compare these accounts with geological evidence from Iraq, Iran, India, and the Sinai Peninsula, some uncomfortable parallels begin to appear. Tonight, we are going to examine 6 ancient discoveries connected to what some researchers believe may have been the weapons of the Anunnaki. Not fantasy weapons, but objects and phenomena that ancient civilizations described with a level of consistency that continues to disturb historians, archaeologists, and military analysts today. We will examine ancient Sumerian tablets, strange artifacts found beneath Mesopotamian ruins, fields of melted glass in the desert, texts hidden for centuries inside restricted archives, and discoveries so controversial that many researchers avoid discussing them publicly altogether. Because whether these stories describe advanced lost technology, misunderstood natural disasters, or something far stranger, they force us to confront a possibility that official history rarely acknowledges. That civilization may not have begun where we think it did. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight, and settle in. Turn off the lights, slow your breathing, and let the ancient world open itself slowly around you. To understand why the Anunnaki mystery refuses to disappear, we need to begin in southern Iraq, in the ruins of the oldest known civilization on Earth. The Sumerians appeared suddenly. That is not speculation. It is one of the genuine mysteries of ancient history. Around the late 4th millennium BCE, fully developed cities emerged in Mesopotamia with writing systems, organized religion, astronomy, legal codes, advanced irrigation, mathematics, and monumental architecture already in place. There is no clear developmental phase leading into it, no primitive version of cuneiform, no gradual architectural experimentation, no slow evolution from village culture into urban civilization. The archaeological record shows a relatively abrupt appearance of highly organized society. Even Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the leading Sumerologists of the 20th century, admitted that many foundational elements of civilization appear in Sumer almost overnight. The Sumerians themselves claim they did not invent this knowledge. According to their texts, civilization was brought by divine beings called the Anunnaki and by semi-divine sages known as the Apkallu. These beings taught humanity writing, engineering, agriculture, astronomy, and law after descending from heaven. Mainstream historians interpret these accounts symbolically, but certain tablets contain descriptions that are difficult to dismiss as pure mythology. One example appears in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic derived partly from older Sumerian traditions. In the text, the god Marduk carries a weapon called Imhulu, translated roughly as the evil wind. At first glance, this sounds poetic, but the descriptions become strangely technical. The weapon creates a storm accompanied by intense heat and pressure. It tears through the sky, it blinds enemies, it produces a roaring sound. It leaves devastation across land and water. In some passages, the text suggests the weapon altered the atmosphere itself. Several Assyriologists have noted that the terminology used differs significantly from normal descriptions of storms in Mesopotamian literature. The text repeatedly emphasizes force, vibration, radiance, and wave-like destruction. Even stranger is another weapon associated with the god Ninurta. It was called Sharur. Unlike ordinary mythological weapons, Sharur is described almost like an intelligent object. It could communicate with its wielder. It could travel independently. It could locate enemies and return after deployment. In one translated hymn, Sharur is described as emitting terrifying light and sound before impact. Some alternative researchers compare it to a guided missile or autonomous drone. That comparison sounds absurd at first, until you realize something important. Ancient mythologies rarely describe weapons this way. Most mythological weapons are symbolic: swords, spears, thunderbolts. But Sharur behaves mechanically, functionally, almost technologically. And these descriptions are not isolated. Across multiple Mesopotamian texts, gods possess devices capable of producing identical effects: blinding light, extreme heat, invisible death, environmental contamination, shock waves, and long-term sickness after exposure. Now, mainstream archaeology does not conclude that the Sumerians possessed advanced weapons. That is important to state clearly. But mainstream archaeology also cannot fully explain why these descriptions contain details that resemble modern categories of warfare more closely than ancient combat. The mystery deepens further when we move from texts to physical evidence. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the Royal Cemetery of Ur. What he discovered shocked the academic world. Beneath layers of dust and collapsed stone were objects unlike anything expected from the Bronze Age. Complex metalwork, precision-crafted instruments, alloys requiring unexpectedly high temperatures, and artifacts whose purposes remain uncertain even today. One small cylindrical object discovered near Ur contained copper, iron, and acidic residue arranged in a configuration remarkably similar to an electrical cell. Decades later, similar objects became known as the Baghdad batteries. Experimental archaeologists demonstrated that these vessels could actually produce measurable electric current when filled with acidic liquid. Not much power, but enough for electroplating or small electrical applications. Which raises a difficult question. If ancient Mesopotamians understood primitive electricity over 2,000 years before Volta, what else did they understand? And more importantly, where did that knowledge come from? The answer may begin with a catastrophe recorded in one of the darkest texts of the ancient world, the Lament for Ur. And in the next part, we will examine why some researchers believe this ancient text may describe the aftermath of a weapon unlike anything the Bronze Age should have known existed. The city of Ur did not die slowly. According to the archaeological record, Something catastrophic happened near the end of the Third Dynasty of Ur, around 2004 BCE. Trade collapsed. Administrative systems vanished. Entire districts were abandoned. And buried within the ruins, Sumerian scribes left behind one of the most disturbing texts of the ancient world. It is known today as the Lament for Ur. At first glance, it reads like a religious mourning text, priests grieving the destruction of a sacred city. But when historians began translating the tablets in detail during the 20th century, certain passages stood out immediately. Because the destruction described does not resemble normal warfare. The text repeatedly references something called the evil wind, not metaphorically, physically. The evil wind moved across the land and killed indiscriminately. Humans collapsed where they stood. Animals died in the fields. Water became poisoned. Crops failed. The air itself became dangerous to breathe. One translated passage reads, "The people, terrified, could scarcely breathe. The evil wind clutched them. Mouths were filled with blood. Heads melted with pain." Another states, "No one walked the roads. No one searched the highways. The fields grew no grain. The fish disappeared from the waters." Historians traditionally interpret this as poetic exaggeration, describing invasion, famine, or plague. But some details are difficult to ignore. The text claims the deadly force arrived from a specific direction. It spread unevenly. Some areas were devastated, while nearby regions remained untouched. People hiding inside sealed spaces reportedly survived longer than those exposed outdoors. And perhaps most unsettling of all, survivors described lingering sickness after the event. Hair loss, skin lesions, weakness, vomiting. Symptoms that modern readers immediately associate with radiation exposure. Now, this does not prove nuclear warfare in the ancient world. That claim remains extremely controversial. But researchers studying ancient disaster narratives have acknowledged that the physical descriptions in the Lament for Ur are unusually precise compared to ordinary Bronze Age accounts of plague or invasion. Even more strange is the geological evidence surrounding several Mesopotamian sites. In southern Iraq, researchers have identified areas where sand appears partially vitrified. In simple terms, exposed to temperatures intense enough to transform it into glass-like material. Natural vitrification can occur during lightning strikes or meteor impacts. But these formations often lack accompanying impact craters, and some are spread across surprisingly wide areas. In the 1970s, geologists examining desert regions near ancient Sumerian territories documented microscopic fused particles inside surface sediments. Similar particles are sometimes associated with high-energy thermal events. Again, mainstream science does not attribute these findings to ancient advanced weapons. Most geologists favor natural explanations, but no single explanation fully accounts for every anomaly. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout the ancient world, and nowhere is it more controversial than at Mohenjo-Daro. Located in present-day Pakistan, Mohenjo-Daro was one of the great cities of the Indus Valley civilization. At its peak around 2500 BCE, it possessed sophisticated drainage systems, standardized brick construction, advanced urban planning, and population densities rivaling later Roman cities. Then something happened. The city declined rapidly. During excavations in the 20th century, archaeologists discovered skeletons scattered through streets and buildings in unusual positions, as though death came suddenly. Several researchers later claimed that some remains showed elevated radiation levels. That claim has been heavily disputed. and many archaeologists reject it entirely. But the myth surrounding Mohenjo-Daro grew because of another detail. The city contains zones where bricks appear exposed to extremely high temperatures. In some sections, surfaces seem partially melted. Conventional explanations include large-scale fires, industrial kilns, or natural heat exposure. Yet alternative researchers notice striking similarities between the destruction patterns and descriptions found in ancient Indian epics, especially the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata contains passages describing weapons called astras. Unlike ordinary arrows or spears, astras were activated through specific invocations and possessed devastating effects. One weapon, the Brahmastra, is described in terms that continue to fascinate military historians and physicists alike. The text states, "A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, bright as 10,000 suns." After impact, the land became barren. Survivors suffered sickness. Food became contaminated. Hair and nails fell out. The parallels to radiation poisoning are impossible to miss. Skeptics argue these are symbolic exaggerations added by later poets. Supporters of the ancient technology theory argue the opposite, that the poets were attempting to describe real events using the only vocabulary available to them. What makes this even more fascinating is that similar descriptions appear independently across unrelated cultures. In Mesopotamia, India, the Levant, ancient Persia, stories of divine wars involving unbearable light, poisoned air, burning winds, and cities erased in moments. Different languages, different religions, yet strangely consistent imagery. By itself, mythology proves nothing. But when mythology overlaps with geological anomalies, archaeological mysteries, and unexplained technological knowledge, historians are forced to confront uncomfortable possibilities. One of those possibilities emerged from an entirely different category of evidence: ancient energy technology. Because if any civilization possessed weapons capable of producing catastrophic effects, they would also require advanced methods of power generation. And that brings us back to one of the strangest discoveries ever made in Iraq, the so-called Baghdad batteries. When German archaeologist Wilhelm König examined these artifacts in the 1930s, he immediately noticed something unusual about their structure. Each consisted of a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod sealed with bitumen. Under normal conditions, the combination serves no obvious decorative or ceremonial purpose. But when modern experimenters recreated the devices using vinegar or grape juice as electrolyte solutions, the jars generated electrical voltage. Small voltage, but real electricity. The implications were explosive. Because if ancient civilizations experimented with electricity, even at primitive levels, entire areas of ancient technology must be reconsidered. Metal plating, chemical processing, medical applications, ritual devices, and potentially weapons. Ancient texts from Mesopotamia repeatedly mention objects associated with priests and gods that emitted light, energy, or invisible force. The Sumerian term Me referred to divine powers or fundamental technologies possessed by the gods. Some scholars interpret them symbolically as laws or cultural principles. Others point out that the texts describe the Me as transferable physical objects stored, stolen, transported, and activated. In one myth, the goddess Inanna steals the Me from Enki and carries them away by boat. The language sounds less like abstract philosophy and more like classified technology. And according to the tablets, among these ME were powers associated with destruction, warfare, divine judgment, and control over nature itself. In the next part, we move deeper into the physical evidence. Because hidden across deserts in Iraq, Egypt, and the Sinai Peninsula are geological scars that should not exist. Massive fields of melted stone, glass fused directly into sand, and traces of temperatures so extreme that some researchers quietly admitted they resembled the aftermath of modern weapons testing. In the deserts of the ancient Near East, there are places where the ground itself appears to have melted. Not metaphorically, literally. Stone transformed into glass, sand fused into hardened sheets, rock surfaces exposed to temperatures so extreme that even modern geologists struggle to explain them completely. One of the most mysterious examples lies near the borders of Egypt and Libya. Today it is called Libyan desert glass. Scattered across hundreds of square kilometers are fragments of translucent yellow-green glass formed almost entirely from melted quartz. Some pieces weigh several kilograms. Others are razor sharp. All of them required temperatures above 1,700 degrees Celsius to form. For comparison, ordinary campfires reach roughly 600 to 800 degrees. Bronze Age furnaces rarely exceeded 1,100. Even modern industrial glass production requires carefully controlled environments to achieve such heat. Yet here, deep in the desert, nature somehow created oceans of molten silica. The accepted explanation is a meteor airburst or impact event. But there is a problem. No confirmed crater exists. Researchers have searched for decades. Several candidates have been proposed, but none fully account for the size and distribution of the glass field. Even more strange is the fact that ancient Egyptians treated this material as sacred. One of the most famous artifacts from Tutankhamun's tomb, the carved scarab at the center of his ceremonial breastplate, was made from Libyan desert glass, which means the material was known, collected, valued, and likely surrounded by myth thousands of years ago. Ancient people clearly encountered this impossible glass and concluded it was connected to divine forces. Now move eastward, into Mesopotamia, into regions associated in Sumerian tradition with battles between gods. There, scattered across sections of Iraq and the Sinai Peninsula, researchers documented additional vitrified zones, patches where surface material appears exposed to catastrophic thermal energy. Again, mainstream geology attributes most of these formations to natural causes: lightning strikes, wildfires, meteoritic activity. But some locations resist clean explanation, especially where thermal damage appears directional. In certain sites near ancient settlement layers, stones are melted only on one side, as though exposed to focused heat rather than generalized fire. This becomes even harder to explain when paired with ancient textual references. Several Mesopotamian tablets describe divine punishments involving fire from the heavens, or storms that burn the earth white. The phrase appears repeatedly in translations connected to the god Enlil. One particularly controversial interpretation comes from passages linked to a location ancient texts call the place of the chariots of the gods. Some alternative historians associate this region with parts of the Sinai Peninsula. According to the theory, it may have functioned as a controlled zone used by the Anunnaki for technology, transport, or warfare. There is no archaeological consensus supporting this interpretation, but something unusual absolutely exists in the region. In the Sinai and surrounding deserts, satellites have detected massive geometric formations visible only from above. Circular patterns, radial lines, burned zones extending for kilometers. Most researchers interpret them as natural erosion or remnants of ancient structures. Yet several formations show evidence of rapid heating inconsistent with ordinary desert weathering. The same pattern appears elsewhere in the world, especially in vitrified forts. Across Scotland, Ireland, France, Turkey, and parts of Iran stand ancient stone fortresses whose walls have partially melted into glass. These are not myths, they are real archaeological sites. For over 2 centuries, historians have debated how this happened. The temperatures required to vitrify granite and basalt exceed 1,200 degrees Celsius. That alone is extraordinary. But the real mystery is directional heat exposure. At many sites, outer wall surfaces are melted, while interior sections remain comparatively intact. This suggests external heat, not internal fire. Some archaeologists propose that defenders intentionally burned walls to strengthen them. But experiments repeatedly fail to reproduce the effect efficiently. Vitrification actually weakens structural stone. It makes little defensive sense. And some fortifications show melting so extensive that ordinary timber-fueled fires could never sustain the required temperatures long enough. So, what happened? No one knows for certain. But researchers studying ancient high-temperature anomalies began noticing something deeply unsettling. The same types of thermal scars appear repeatedly near locations tied to myths of divine warfare. In India, near sites connected to the Mahabharata. In Mesopotamia, near cities associated with the evil wind. In the Levant, near regions tied to the destruction narratives later absorbed into biblical traditions. One example stands out above all others: Tall el-Hammam. Located northeast of the Dead Sea, the site was once a prosperous Bronze Age city. Around 1650 BCE, it was abruptly destroyed. Excavations revealed something extraordinary. Mud bricks melted on one side, pottery transformed into glass-like material, human remains fragmented by massive pressure waves, quartz shocked at microscopic levels. A 2021 scientific paper proposed that the city may have been destroyed by a cosmic airburst similar to the Tunguska event. In other words, an explosion in the atmosphere, releasing energy comparable to a nuclear detonation. The theory remains debated, but the physical evidence of extreme heat is undeniable. Some materials at the site were exposed to temperatures above 2,000 degrees Celsius for a very brief period. That is hotter than most volcanic eruptions. And according to ancient traditions preserved later in biblical literature, this exact region was associated with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, a city destroyed by fire descending from the sky. Again, this does not prove ancient advanced weapons. Natural cosmic events absolutely occur. But for many researchers, the disturbing question is not whether ancient people witnessed catastrophic thermal events. Clearly, they did. The question is whether some of those events were natural at all. Because the ancient texts are strangely specific, they do not merely describe fire. They describe targeted destruction, controlled force, weapons carried or activated by beings associated with the heavens. And this is where the mystery shifts from geology to engineering. Because several ancient cultures did not simply describe destructive power. They described machines. Machines capable of flight. Machines emitting energy. Machines operated by the gods themselves. In Sumerian texts, these devices were sometimes referred to as gears. In Sanskrit literature, they became known as Vimanas. And the descriptions are far more technical than most people realize. Some accounts mention noise like 1,000 storms. Others describe vessels rising vertically into the sky, surrounded by blazing light. Several texts even differentiate between classes of aerial craft, their movement patterns, and their functions, which raises a question historians still argue about today. Were ancient people simply imagining divine chariots? Or were they attempting to describe technologies they lacked the language to understand? In the next part, we examine the flying machines of the gods, and the disturbing possibility that ancient civilizations may have inherited fragments of technological knowledge from a forgotten world long before recorded history began, long before the Wright brothers built their first aircraft, long before Leonardo da Vinci sketched flying machines. Ancient civilizations were already writing about objects that moved through the sky with impossible speed, terrifying sound, and destructive power. The most famous examples come from ancient India, but similar accounts also appear in Mesopotamian, Persian, and even early Hebrew traditions. The Sanskrit term is Vimana. Most modern translations simplify the word as chariot, but the original descriptions are far more complicated than that. In texts like the Mahabharata, Ramayana, and several later Vedic compilations, Vimanas are described as structured vehicles capable of aerial movement, rapid acceleration, hovering, and long-distance travel. Some are small, others are enormous. A few are described almost like mobile cities. One passage from the Ramayana describes a craft called the Pushpaka Vimana. It moved with the speed of the wind. It made a noise like thunder. It shone like the sun in the sky. Another describes operators controlling motion through specialized mechanisms and energy sources. This alone would not be remarkable. Mythologies are full of magical transportation, but certain technical details continue to attract attention from aerospace researchers and historians of technology. Several Sanskrit texts distinguish between propulsion systems. Some Vimanas use fire and mercury-like substances. Others generate circular wind or radiant energy. One later manuscript even describes reflective heat shields and rotational stabilization. Most mainstream historians reject these descriptions as symbolic or medieval fantasy, added centuries later. And they may be right, but the problem is consistency. The imagery appears repeatedly across independent traditions over long periods of time, and Mesopotamia contains parallel descriptions. In Sumerian texts, gods frequently travel inside objects associated with brightness, thunder, smoke, and fire. The Sumerian term GIR appears in several disputed translations connected to celestial movement and divine transportation. One Akkadian text describes a god descending in a chamber of blazing brilliance. Another references the boat of heaven, whose roar terrified entire cities. What ancient people consistently emphasize is not beauty. It is power. The noise, the heat, the vibration, and perhaps most intriguingly, the fear. Witnesses in these texts react not with wonder, but terror. Now consider this from a modern engineering perspective. If ancient observers witnessed advanced aerial technology without scientific vocabulary, how would they describe it? Probably exactly this way: thunder, fire, roaring wind, divine radiance. The same process happened throughout human history. Indigenous populations encountering firearms described thunder sticks. Early electricity demonstrations were considered magic. Even today, military eyewitnesses often struggle to describe classified aerospace technology accurately. Language always lags behind technology, and this becomes especially important when examining one of the most controversial texts ever associated with ancient flight technology, the Vaimanika Shastra. According to its supporters, the manuscript preserves ancient knowledge concerning aerial vehicles. It includes descriptions of flight mechanics, pilot clothing, materials, mirrors, weapon systems, and propulsion methods. Most scholars argue the text is not genuinely ancient and likely dates to the early 20th century. A detailed scientific review conducted in India in the 1970s concluded that the described aircraft were aerodynamically unworkable. But even critics admitted something strange. The text contains highly technical terminology for someone supposedly inventing pure fantasy. Detailed references to alloys, energy chambers, heat absorption, directional control systems, complex geometries. It reads less like mythology and more like a confused reconstruction of partially understood engineering concepts. That distinction matters because many researchers no longer argue that ancient civilizations built jet aircraft. Instead, they suggest something more subtle, that fragments of technological memory survived through myth, distorted over generations, wrapped in religious symbolism, yet still preserving echoes of real machines. And there may be physical evidence supporting that possibility. In Egypt, inside the temple of Seti, the first at Abydos, there is a famous carving often called the Abydos helicopter. The image appears to resemble a helicopter, submarine, and aircraft grouped together. Mainstream Egyptologists explain this as overlapping hieroglyphs caused by erosion and recarving. Technically, that explanation is correct, but the fascination surrounding the carving reveals something deeper. Across ancient cultures, people repeatedly encounter imagery that seems strangely technological. Not because the ancients necessarily possessed modern machines, but because many depictions contain structural forms unexpectedly similar to later engineering. The same debate surrounds the so-called Saqqara bird. Discovered in Egypt in 1898, the object resembles a bird at first glance. Yet aerodynamic engineers later noted unusual design features: vertical stabilizer, wing proportions, lack of traditional bird anatomy. Some researchers proposed it functioned as a glider model or symbolic representation of flight technology. Again, mainstream archaeology considers it ceremonial, but the pattern repeats. Ancient objects that resemble engineered systems appear across multiple civilizations, usually dismissed individually, rarely considered together. And then there are the gods themselves. The Anunnaki are consistently described not as abstract spirits, but as physical beings. They eat, sleep, travel, fight, bleed, operate tools, and wear specialized garments associated with radiance and protection. One Sumerian term appears repeatedly in connection with divine presence, Melam, usually translated as divine radiance. But the descriptions are highly unusual. Melam surrounds the gods like an invisible field. Humans cannot look directly at it. It terrifies enemies. It can protect or destroy depending on proximity. Some tablets describe kings temporarily receiving Melam from the gods before battle, almost like activating a form of projected power. Alternative researchers compare this to electromagnetic shielding, plasma effects, or radiation fields. Those interpretations remain speculative, but what matters is the recurring association between advanced power and visible energetic phenomena. Ancient writers consistently struggled to describe effects involving light, force, vibration, and physiological impact, which leads directly into another deeply controversial area of research: ancient radiation exposure. Because several archaeological discoveries suggest that some ancient populations encountered environmental conditions strangely similar to modern nuclear contamination. And nowhere is this debate more intense than around sites where skeletons were discovered in positions suggesting sudden, catastrophic death. At several Bronze Age destruction layers, researchers documented elevated magnetic anomalies, vitrified materials, and unusual mineral transformations associated with rapid heating. Most of these can be explained naturally, but not all comfortably. In portions of Rajasthan, India, local legends still describe forbidden zones associated with ancient divine warfare. Near some of these areas, unusually high background radiation levels have periodically been reported. Most measurements fall within explainable geological variation. Yet the mythology persisted for thousands of years before modern instruments existed. Stories of cursed land, poisoned water, invisible sickness, entire regions abandoned after heavenly fire. The same narrative structure appears again and again. And perhaps most unsettling of all, ancient texts occasionally describe attempts to survive these events. Sheltering underground, sealing chambers, wearing protective coverings, avoiding contaminated rain. In one Sanskrit passage following deployment of a celestial weapon, survivors are instructed to bathe repeatedly and destroy exposed garments. That sounds disturbingly modern, because those are standard decontamination procedures. Now, coincidence is always possible. Human imagination naturally overlaps with universal fears. But the accumulation of details is what keeps this mystery alive. One text alone proves nothing. One melted stone proves nothing. One strange artifact proves nothing. But together, the patterns become difficult to ignore. And hidden behind many of these discoveries lies another mystery few people ever discuss publicly. Because over the past century, countless artifacts connected to Mesopotamia vanished into private collections, restricted archives, or war zones. Some disappeared during conflicts, others were confiscated quietly, and according to several researchers, a surprising number may now sit beyond public access entirely. Inside museum vaults, inside intelligence archives, and possibly inside the Vatican itself. In the next part, we enter one of the most secretive institutions on Earth and examine why some historians believe the Vatican archives may contain records connected to forbidden discoveries about humanity's forgotten past. Few institutions on Earth generate more speculation than the Vatican Apostolic Archive. For centuries, rumors have surrounded its underground chambers. Forbidden gospels, suppressed histories, lost scientific documents, accounts of impossible events hidden from the public eye. Most of those rumors are exaggerated. The Vatican Archive is not a secret dungeon filled with alien skeletons and magical relics. It is primarily an enormous historical repository containing millions of documents collected over more than 1,000 years. But among historians, one fact remains undeniable. The Vatican possesses one of the largest collections of ancient Near Eastern manuscripts in existence, and many of them remain only partially studied. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European archaeologists excavated Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant, enormous numbers of tablets, scrolls, and artifacts flowed into private collections, museums, and religious institutions. Some disappeared into academic archives. Others vanished entirely. Several researchers have pointed out that fragments of untranslated Sumerian and Akkadian texts were quietly transferred into ecclesiastical collections during periods of political instability in Iraq and Syria. Not because the church was hiding aliens, but because ancient texts often intersected with biblical history, and that intersection became deeply uncomfortable. Because the more Assyriologists translated Mesopotamian tablets, the more they discovered stories predating the Bible itself. Creation narratives, flood accounts, divine councils, heavenly beings descending to earth. Even the structure of Genesis suddenly appeared connected to much older Sumerian traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative centuries older than Noah. The Atrahasis epic describes gods creating humanity through biological processes involving clay and divine essence. And the Book of Enoch, one of the most controversial ancient Jewish texts ever written, describes celestial beings descending from heaven and transmitting forbidden knowledge to humanity. Metallurgy, weapon-making, astronomy, sorcery. The parallels with the Anunnaki traditions are impossible to ignore. This is where the Vatican mystery becomes relevant. Because certain early Christian scholars were deeply aware of these connections. Church theologians in late antiquity debated whether pre-flood civilizations possessed advanced knowledge lost after divine judgment. Some even speculated that fallen angels transmitted dangerous sciences to humanity before the flood. In other words, the idea that ancient civilizations possessed forbidden technology is not modern. Versions of it existed inside theological traditions nearly 2,000 years ago. One particularly strange example appears in interpretations surrounding the Watchers. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descend from heaven onto Mount Hermon and teach humanity forbidden arts. Among them, metal weapon construction, astrology, enchantments, the cutting of roots, often interpreted as chemistry or pharmacology. One figure, Azazel, specifically teaches humans how to forge weapons and armor. As punishment, the Watchers are destroyed and imprisoned beneath the earth. For centuries, these stories were dismissed as symbolic mythology. Then archaeology complicated everything. Because throughout Mesopotamia, evidence emerged showing unexpectedly advanced metallurgical capabilities far earlier than previously believed. At sites associated with Sumerian civilization, archaeologists uncovered precision metalworking, requiring furnace temperatures difficult to explain through primitive Bronze Age methods alone. Certain artifacts contain alloy compositions that imply sophisticated control over heating environments. Again, none of this proves lost super technology, but it reinforces an uncomfortable truth. Ancient civilizations were more technically capable than older historical models allowed. And that realization forced institutions, including religious institutions, to reconsider ancient history carefully. Now add another layer. During the 20th century, multiple expeditions into Iraq, Syria, and Iran reported discoveries that were never fully published. Missing tablets, restricted excavation reports, artifacts transferred quietly between institutions. Sometimes this happened for ordinary political reasons. Wars, looting, black market trafficking. But occasionally, researchers themselves hinted at something stranger. British Assyriologist Reginald Campbell Thompson once referenced fragments describing weapons of divine terror, capable of making land uninhabitable. French researcher Anton Parks later argued that several untranslated texts referred to airborne machines and destructive energy phenomena far more explicitly than official translations admitted. Most mainstream historians reject Parks entirely. Yet even conventional scholarship acknowledges a translation problem. Many Sumerian technical terms have no direct modern equivalent. When translators encounter words associated with radiance, vibration, force, celestial movement, or unknown devices, interpretation becomes subjective. One translator might write divine brilliance. Another might write radiating field. The original meaning remains uncertain, and uncertainty creates controversy, especially when certain descriptions begin sounding unexpectedly modern. For example, several Akkadian texts describe divine weapons producing effects called the brilliance that strips flesh. Others mention winds that poison the land. One damaged tablet references survivors hiding underground while the storm passed above. Again, this may all be metaphorical, but researchers studying comparative disaster narratives notice something disturbing. Ancient descriptions of divine punishment often contain environmental details consistent with real, large-scale catastrophe, not symbolic morality tales. Observable physical effects, darkened skies, contaminated water, failed harvests, lingering sickness, mass depopulation. And this leads us directly to one of the most controversial theories surrounding the Vatican and ancient archives. The possibility that humanity once experienced a technologically driven collapse long before recorded history officially begins. Not merely local disasters, a civilizational reset. Supporters of this theory point to recurring flood myths across nearly every ancient culture on Earth. Sumerian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Mesoamerican. The details differ, but the structure remains strangely similar. An advanced earlier age, divine conflict or corruption, catastrophic destruction, a small group of survivors preserving knowledge. Even Plato's Atlantis narrative follows the same pattern. A technologically advanced civilization destroyed suddenly due to moral and cosmic imbalance. Mainstream historians explain this through universal myth-making psychology and memories of regional floods after the last ice age. And they may be correct. But there is another reason these stories persist. Because archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that human prehistory was far more complex than once believed. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, currently the oldest monumental religious site ever discovered, archaeologists uncovered massive stone structures dating back roughly 11,600 years. That is thousands of years before Sumer, thousands of years before agriculture supposedly became widespread. Yet the builders organized labor, transported enormous stones, aligned structures astronomically, and created symbolic systems sophisticated enough to challenge conventional timelines entirely. It should not exist, at least not according to older models of civilization. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Around the world, researchers keep discovering signs that organized human culture may extend far deeper into the past than previously imagined. Which raises a disturbing possibility. What if the Anunnaki stories survived not because ancient people invented them, but because they inherited fragmented memories from a forgotten age? An age of knowledge, an age of power, an age that ended violently. And if that is true, then the ancient weapons described in Mesopotamian tablets may not represent fantasy at all. They may represent distorted historical memory, the final echoes of technologies lost in a catastrophe so complete that later civilizations transformed engineers into gods. In the next part, we descend beneath the Zagros Mountains, where a controversial modern discovery reignited the entire Anunnaki debate. Hidden cave systems containing unexplained carvings, strange metallic objects, and imagery unlike anything ever found in traditional Mesopotamian archaeology. The Zagros Mountains stretch across western Iran and northern Iraq like the spine of an ancient world. For thousands of years, armies crossed them. Traders disappeared into them. Entire civilizations rose and vanished in their shadows. But according to local Kurdish traditions, parts of the Zagros were always avoided for another reason. The mountains were said to contain sealed places, places where the old gods once hid their weapons. Most historians dismiss these stories as folklore. Yet in 2008, reports emerged from a remote archaeological survey in western Iran, describing something highly unusual discovered inside a partially collapsed cave system near the Iraqi border. The official excavation records were never fully released. That alone is not uncommon. Political instability often interrupts archaeological work in the region. But according to leaked accounts from several individuals allegedly connected to the survey, the cave walls contained carvings unlike standard Mesopotamian religious art. Not kings, not livestock, not ordinary ritual scenes, but humanoid figures holding elongated objects emitting lines or beams toward other figures. Several carvings reportedly showed circular objects hovering above mountains with radiating patterns beneath them. One sketch, published briefly in an independent Iranian journal before disappearing online, depicted what looked disturbingly similar to directed energy imagery. Mainstream archaeologists strongly caution against interpreting ancient iconography through modern technological assumptions, and they are right to do so. Human beings naturally project familiar patterns onto ambiguous images. But the controversy intensified because of what was allegedly found deeper inside the cave complex: metallic objects. One described as a cylindrical artifact roughly 30 centimeters long, perforated with spiral openings. Another as a flat circular disc etched with concentric geometric patterns unlike known cuneiform writing. No verified public photographs exist. No peer-reviewed publication confirmed the discovery, which means the entire story could be exaggerated or entirely false. And yet, similar rumors have followed Near Eastern archaeology for decades. Stories of restricted artifacts, objects removed before public cataloging, discoveries quietly transferred into private or institutional collections. Sometimes these claims are nonsense. Sometimes they are impossible to verify. But occasionally, fragments surface from credible sources that keep the speculation alive, especially when they intersect with older traditions already embedded in local memory. Among Kurdish oral histories, there are legends describing children of the stars. According to these stories, beings descended from the heavens in ancient times, carrying tools that emitted light and thunder. They taught metallurgy, irrigation, astronomy, and stone cutting. Then came a war. Not between humans, between the sky beings themselves. The mountains became shelters during this conflict because the open land was struck by burning winds and invisible death. Again, these are legends. But remarkably similar traditions exist throughout the Middle East. The Yazidis speak of 7 luminous beings who descended to govern the earth. Certain Mandaean texts describe radiant entities arriving in ships of light. Ancient Arabian traditions speak of powerful pre-human beings, capable of flying machines and weapons that scorched entire regions. Different cultures, different religions, yet recurring themes: heavenly visitors, advanced knowledge, catastrophic war, survivors hiding underground. And this is where archaeology becomes deeply uncomfortable, because caves and subterranean complexes appear constantly throughout ancient catastrophe narratives. In Mesopotamia, in India, in Central America. even in biblical tradition. Why? Partly because caves naturally preserve life during disaster, but also because underground shelter is one of the few effective protections against blast waves, thermal radiation, and contaminated atmosphere. That observation has led some researchers to re-examine ancient underground structures from a completely different perspective. Take Derinkuyu in Turkey. Discovered in the 20th century beneath Cappadocia, Derinkuyu is an enormous underground city extending multiple levels beneath the surface. At its peak, it may have sheltered over 20,000 people. It contained ventilation systems, water wells, storage chambers, livestock areas, stone ceiling doors. Official archaeology explains these underground cities as defensive refuges against invasion, which is absolutely plausible. But some researchers ask a different question. Why build survival systems this extensive, unless populations feared prolonged environmental catastrophe? And why do so many ancient traditions connect underground refuge with heavenly destruction? The same pattern appears in India after deployment of divine astras. It appears in Near Eastern flood myths. It appears in Mesoamerican accounts of previous world ages destroyed by fire. The consistency is difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, modern scientific discoveries continue complicating our understanding of the ancient world. In recent decades, physicists and archaeologists working together have identified evidence of ancient high-temperature events at multiple sites once considered ordinary destruction layers. Microscopic spherules, shock-fractured quartz, melted ceramics, magnetic anomalies. These do not automatically imply advanced weapons. Most can result from cosmic impacts, volcanic activity, or large urban fires. But the important point is this: ancient civilizations repeatedly experienced catastrophic energy events far beyond normal Bronze Age warfare, and they remembered them, sometimes mythologized, sometimes ritualized, sometimes encoded into religious narratives. Which brings us back to the Anunnaki themselves. The word Anunnaki is often mistranslated online. It does not literally mean aliens. Most scholars interpret it roughly as offspring of Anu, referring to divine beings associated with the sky god Anu. But even within mainstream translation, the Anunnaki were not abstract spiritual concepts. They operated physically within the world. They traveled, ruled cities, commanded technologies, fought wars, and possessed hierarchies resembling administration more than theology. Several tablets even describe disagreements among the gods concerning humanity. Enlil wishes to destroy mankind because humans become disruptive and noisy. Enki intervenes repeatedly to preserve them. This dynamic feels strangely human, political, strategic, not purely symbolic. One controversial interpretation proposed by Zecharia Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors connected to a distant planet called Nibiru. Mainstream Assyriologists overwhelmingly reject Sitchin's translations. Many of his interpretations are linguistically unsupported. That is important to acknowledge clearly. But even critics admit something significant. The original Sumerian texts remain genuinely strange, especially regarding celestial knowledge. The MUL.APIN tablets and Enuma Anu Enlil contain highly sophisticated astronomical observations. Planetary cycles, eclipses, celestial movements tracked over enormous periods. For a civilization supposedly emerging from primitive agriculture, the astronomical precision is astonishing. Some scholars explain this through centuries of careful, naked-eye observation. Others suspect fragments of older inherited systems may have existed. And then there is Nibiru itself. In mainstream translation, Nibiru likely refers to a celestial crossing point, or occasionally Jupiter, not necessarily a hidden planet. Yet ancient texts consistently associate it with upheaval, transition, and divine authority. Modern fringe theories transformed Nibiru into a rogue planet carrying the Anunnaki. There is no scientific evidence supporting that idea. But the persistence of celestial catastrophe myths across civilizations remains fascinating. Because ancient people clearly believed the heavens could bring destruction, sometimes suddenly, sometimes cyclically. And if even part of those beliefs emerged from real historical events, then humanity may have inherited cultural trauma far older than recorded civilization itself. In the next part, we examine one of the most important and controversial questions of all. If ancient advanced technology truly existed, why did it disappear? And why do so many civilizations describe a great collapse, a forgotten age, buried beneath flood, fire, and silence? Every civilization tells the same story eventually. There was once an earlier age, an age of greater knowledge, greater power, greater arrogance. And then it ended. Flood, fire, darkness. The details change depending on the culture, but the structure remains remarkably consistent across continents separated by oceans and thousands of years. The Sumerians spoke of kings who ruled before the Great Flood. The Egyptians described Zep-Tepi, the first time, an era when gods walked openly among humans. The Greeks remembered Atlantis. The Hindus described previous world cycles destroyed by celestial warfare. The Maya believed earlier creations of humanity had been erased before the current age began. Modern historians usually explain these myths as symbolic memory, blended with regional natural disasters. And certainly, ancient people experienced catastrophic floods, volcanic eruptions, droughts, and earthquakes. But over the last 30 years, archaeology has introduced a deeply unsettling complication. Human civilization may be far older and more cyclical than previously believed. The turning point came in southeastern Turkey. Göbekli Tepe. Discovered officially in the 1990s, the site shattered conventional timelines almost immediately. Massive stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in complex circular enclosures. Sophisticated carvings, astronomical alignments, advanced symbolic systems. And the date, roughly 9,600 BCE. That is older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than Sumer itself. According to older historical models, humans at that time were still primitive hunter-gatherers barely emerging from the Ice Age. Yet Göbekli Tepe required organized labor, engineering knowledge, long-term planning, and social coordination on a scale nobody expected. It should not exist. And once archaeologists accepted Göbekli Tepe, other anomalies suddenly became harder to dismiss. Advanced stonework at Baalbek in Lebanon, megalithic precision in Peru, submerged structures near Yonaguni in Japan, ancient astronomical alignments encoded into monuments across multiple continents. Individually, each site has conventional explanations. Together, they suggest something larger, that humanity's developmental timeline may not have been linear. Perhaps civilizations rose, collapsed, and rose again. Perhaps knowledge was lost repeatedly, and perhaps myths about the Anunnaki preserve distorted memories of one such lost era. This possibility changes how researchers interpret ancient weapons narratives. Because If a technologically advanced culture collapsed thousands of years before recorded history, later civilizations would encounter its ruins the same way medieval Europeans encountered Roman aqueducts, as incomprehensible remnants of gods. Imagine discovering fragments of advanced technology without understanding the science behind them. A sealed energy device, a metallic alloy impossible to reproduce, a partially functioning machine. To ancient observers, such objects would appear supernatural, and over generations, the engineers who built them would become deities in collective memory. This idea is not new. Even Plato hinted at it indirectly. In Timaeus and Critias, Egyptian priests tell Solon that humanity repeatedly forgets its past because civilization is periodically destroyed by catastrophe. Many destructions of mankind have been and will be. Floods, fire from the heavens, cosmic disaster. Each time, survivors rebuild from fragments. Now consider what happened around 12,800 years ago. At the end of the last ice age, Earth experienced a sudden climatic disruption known as the Younger Dryas. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Large animal species vanished. Sea levels eventually rose more than 100 meters worldwide. Some researchers propose a fragmented comet impact triggered the event. Evidence remains debated, but several sites contain microscopic spherules, melt glass, and shock indicators associated with high-energy atmospheric explosions. If true, entire coastal civilizations from that period would now lie underwater. And that matters because most ancient civilizations developed near coastlines and rivers. The oldest settlements of a forgotten culture would be the hardest to find today, submerged beneath oceans, erased by time. This possibility has led some historians and geologists to quietly revisit ancient flood myths with new seriousness. Not because Noah literally built an ark, but because many flood stories may preserve cultural memory of real post-Ice Age catastrophe. And hidden inside those memories may be fragments of something else. Technological inheritance. Several ancient traditions explicitly state that knowledge survived catastrophe through selected individuals. In Mesopotamia, Utnapishtim survives the flood carrying divine knowledge. In Egypt, Thoth preserves sacred sciences. In India, sages preserve astronomical and mathematical systems after world destruction. The pattern repeats constantly. Civilization collapses. Knowledge fragments survive. Later generations mythologize the source. Now think carefully about what that means for the so-called weapons of the gods. Perhaps they were never supernatural. Perhaps they were misunderstood remnants of technologies inherited from a previous age. That would explain several things simultaneously. Why advanced concepts appear suddenly in early civilizations? Why myths worldwide describe catastrophic divine wars? Why certain archaeological anomalies involve extreme heat and unexplained engineering? And why ancient people consistently describe the bearers of knowledge as beings who descended from the heavens? Because to primitive survivors, advanced humans arriving in aircraft would absolutely appear divine. Even modern humans would react similarly under the right circumstances. Arthur C. Clarke famously wrote, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." Ancient humanity may have experienced exactly that phenomenon. But there is another reason this theory remains controversial. It threatens the foundation of historical continuity. Modern civilization sees itself as the pinnacle of human progress. The assumption is comforting. We are the most advanced humans who have ever lived. History moves upward, always forward. Yet archaeology increasingly suggests something more fragile. That civilization is vulnerable. That knowledge can disappear. That collapse can happen faster than societies imagine. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BC. Demonstrated this dramatically. Within decades, major Mediterranean civilizations disintegrated. Trade vanished. Writing systems disappeared. Entire populations migrated or died. Complex societies reverted into centuries of fragmentation. And that collapse occurred without nuclear war or planetary catastrophe. Now imagine a truly global disaster, a comet impact, a chain of volcanic eruptions, runaway warfare involving advanced technology. How much would survive after several thousand years? Very little, especially if later survivors interpreted remaining artifacts through religion and myth. This may explain one of the strangest aspects of ancient technology legends. Why so many stories emphasize that the knowledge was dangerous, forbidden, restricted. In both Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, advanced knowledge repeatedly leads to catastrophe. The gods punish humanity after forbidden sciences spread. The Watchers are imprisoned. Divine weapons devastate cities. The implication is clear. Power exceeded wisdom. And perhaps that warning matters more than whether the Anunnaki were real. Because modern humanity now stands in a strangely similar position. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, autonomous weapons, quantum systems. We are developing technologies capable of reshaping civilization itself. Yet psychologically, humanity remains much the same as it was 5,000 years ago. Competitive, tribal, violent, short-sighted. Ancient myths may not be literal history, but they may preserve something equally valuable. A warning from civilizations that discovered power before learning restraint. And if that interpretation is correct, then the true mystery is not whether the Anunnaki existed. The true mystery is whether humanity is destined to repeat the same cycle again. In the next part, we investigate the 6 specific ancient discoveries most often cited by researchers as evidence for impossible technology, including mysterious alloys, unexplained energy artifacts, anomalous radiation sites, and the object many believe may represent the closest thing ever found to an ancient machine. Of all the discoveries connected to ancient advanced technology theories, 6 stand apart from the rest. Not because they conclusively prove the existence of Anunnaki weapons, they do not, but because each one presents a genuine anomaly, a point where archaeology, geology, engineering, and ancient testimony intersect in ways that remain deeply uncomfortable for conventional history. The first is the Baghdad Battery. Discovered near Qujut Rabu outside Baghdad, the artifact dates roughly between 250 BCE and 250 CE. At first glance, it appears simple. A clay jar containing a copper cylinder and iron rod sealed with bitumen. But when reconstructed using acidic liquid, it produces electrical current. Modern tests confirm this repeatedly. The voltage is weak, but real. Skeptics argue the object may have served another purpose entirely, perhaps storage or ritual use, and that is possible. But no fully convincing alternative explanation exists. Meanwhile, electroplated artifacts from the ancient world continue raising difficult questions. Some ancient objects possess metallic coatings so thin and uniform that researchers debated whether primitive electrochemical techniques may have been used long before modern electricity was officially discovered. No consensus exists, yet the possibility remains open. The second anomaly is the vitrified forts. Across Scotland and parts of Europe, massive stone fortifications display walls partially melted into glass. Temperatures required for this process exceed 1,200 degrees Celsius. Experiments attempting to reproduce the effect with ordinary fires achieved only partial success under extreme conditions. More importantly, many fort walls appear melted from external heat exposure rather than internal burning. That detail continues to divide archaeologists. Some believe vitrification occurred accidentally during attacks. Others suspect ritual destruction. Alternative researchers propose concentrated thermal energy, unlike anything associated with Iron Age warfare. No explanation fully satisfies all evidence. The third anomaly lies beneath the sands of Mesopotamia itself. Unusual alloy composition. Several metallic objects recovered from Sumerian and Akkadian sites contain manufacturing characteristics difficult to reconcile with expected Bronze Age furnace capabilities. Particularly intriguing are traces of high-temperature processing exceeding normal ancient metallurgical assumptions. Now, it is important to be careful here. Ancient people were highly skilled engineers. Modern audiences often underestimate them. Bronze Age craftsmen achieved extraordinary precision without modern machinery. But certain artifacts still challenge historians because they suggest controlled heating environments more sophisticated than expected for the era. One Assyrian artifact discovered near Nineveh contains complex layered metallurgy whose exact production process remains debated even today. Again, not proof of alien technology, but evidence that ancient engineering knowledge may have been significantly more advanced than older textbooks assumed. The fourth anomaly involves radiation claims. This is perhaps the most controversial category of all. Stories surrounding Mohenjo-Daro, Rajasthan, and several Middle Eastern sites often become exaggerated online. Claims of ancient nuclear wars circulate widely despite weak evidence. Most scientists reject those conclusions entirely. However, isolated anomalies remain intriguing. At several archaeological destruction layers, researchers documented unusual magnetic signatures, microspherules formed under intense heat, and mineral shock patterns associated with high-energy events. Some resemble known cosmic impact effects. Others remain disputed. The real mystery is not radiation itself. It is the consistency of ancient descriptions involving invisible contamination after catastrophic events. Land becoming uninhabitable, water poisoned, illness lingering long after destruction ended. Ancient texts repeatedly distinguish between ordinary fire and a different kind of deadly force, one that could not always be seen. That distinction matters, especially because pre-scientific societies usually describe visible destruction symbolically, while invisible environmental damage receives surprisingly technical treatment. The fifth anomaly may be the strangest: the Dendera light. Inside the Temple of Hathor at Dendera in Egypt are relief carvings that some researchers believe resemble large glass bulbs connected to cable-like structures. Official Egyptology interprets them symbolically. A serpent emerging from a lotus flower representing creation and divine power. And from a religious perspective, that interpretation is entirely valid. But engineers examining the relief notice something unexpected. The shape resembles a Crookes tube, or primitive discharge lamp, an elongated chamber, internal filament-like figure, support structure, cable-shaped extension. Some alternative researchers propose the Egyptians possessed electrical lighting technology. Mainstream scholars reject this strongly. No wires, generators, or supporting infrastructure have been found. Yet the mystery persists for one simple reason. The imagery looks strangely technological to modern eyes. And even more puzzling, many deep Egyptian chambers contain surprisingly little soot, despite supposedly being illuminated by torches during construction and decoration. Several conventional explanations exist: reflective mirrors, oil lamps with minimal smoke, ventilation systems. Still, debate continues. Because ancient Egypt repeatedly demonstrates technical sophistication exceeding what earlier historians believed possible. Then there is the sixth anomaly, the one many researchers consider the most important of all. The ancient texts themselves. Not one tablet, thousands, across centuries, across civilizations, describing the same categories of phenomena repeatedly. Flying machines, weapons emitting light and heat, invisible destructive force, protective garments, divine radiance, catastrophic environmental collapse, and beings descending from the heavens carrying knowledge. Skeptics argue mythology naturally converges around archetypal imagery, and they are partly correct. Human storytelling follows recognizable patterns. But comparative mythologists have noted something fascinating. The oldest myths are often less fantastical than later versions. Earlier Mesopotamian texts describe the gods more physically, more mechanically, more grounded. Over time, stories become increasingly symbolic and supernatural. It is almost as if historical memory gradually transformed into religion. This process happens constantly in human culture. Real kings become legends. Real disasters become divine punishment. Real technologies become magical artifacts. Imagine what would happen if fragments of advanced engineering survived after societal collapse. Over centuries, survivors would preserve terminology without understanding functionality. A power source becomes the sacred fire. Protective equipment becomes divine garments. Aircraft become chariots of heaven. Directed energy weapons become lightning of the gods. And eventually, history becomes mythology. This theory remains speculative, but it explains something extremely important: why ancient people often described advanced effects accurately while misunderstanding their causes. Exactly what we would expect from witnesses observing technologies beyond their scientific framework. And perhaps that is the true reason the Anunnaki mystery refuses to disappear. Not because people want fantasy, but because archaeology increasingly reveals that human history is incomplete. Far more incomplete than most institutions are comfortable admitting. Entire chapters are missing. Civilizations lost beneath oceans, languages undeciphered, artifacts destroyed in war, sites inaccessible due to politics or conflict. The deeper researchers dig into antiquity, the more uncertain the official timeline becomes, and uncertainty creates space for dangerous questions. Questions like, what if civilization has collapsed before? What if advanced knowledge existed long before recorded history? What if ancient myths preserve fragments of real technological memory? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what if the warnings hidden inside those myths were meant for us? Because modern humanity now possesses the exact kind of power ancient texts feared most. Weapons capable of poisoning land, burning cities instantly, darkening skies, altering life itself. The ancient world may not have understood atoms, radiation, or quantum mechanics, but they understood catastrophe, and they understood something else too. That knowledge without wisdom becomes destruction. In the next part, we leave archaeology behind and enter the psychology of civilization itself, examining why nearly every ancient culture encoded warnings about forbidden technology, divine punishment, and cycles of collapse repeating across human history. Modern civilization believes progress is permanent. Ancient civilizations did not. That difference may be one of the most important psychological shifts in human history. Today, we assume technology inevitably moves forward. Faster computers, better medicine, more powerful energy systems. We imagine history as a straight ascending line from primitive ignorance toward mastery. But the ancient world viewed civilization differently. Fragile, temporary, always standing near collapse. And buried inside myths from nearly every major culture is the same warning. Knowledge can destroy the people who possess it. This theme appears constantly in Mesopotamian literature. The gods grant humanity power, then regret it. Humans become violent, arrogant, disruptive. Divine weapons are unleashed. Civilization resets. Even the Great Flood in Sumerian tradition begins not because humanity is evil in the modern moral sense, but because humans have become uncontrollable. Too loud, too numerous, too technologically active. The disturbing implication is that advanced civilization itself was considered dangerous. Now compare that with Greek mythology. Prometheus gives humanity fire, usually interpreted as technology, knowledge, or civilization itself. For this act, he is punished eternally. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Certain forms of knowledge come with catastrophic consequences. The same pattern exists in the Book of Enoch. The Watchers descend from heaven and teach forbidden sciences. Weapon forging, astronomy, metallurgy, cosmetic chemistry, incantations. Humanity becomes corrupted. Violence spreads. The world collapses into chaos. Again and again, ancient traditions repeat the same sequence. Advanced knowledge arrives. Society destabilizes. Catastrophe follows. This is psychologically fascinating because these stories emerged independently across multiple civilizations, separated by geography and time. Why would cultures preserve the same fear repeatedly? One explanation is obvious. Technology genuinely destabilizes societies, and history proves it. Bronze weapons transformed warfare. Iron destroyed Bronze Age empires. Gunpowder reshaped civilization permanently. Industrialization altered human psychology. Politics, economics, and the environment within only a few generations. Nuclear weapons introduced extinction-level capability for the first time in recorded history. Every major technological leap fundamentally changes human behavior faster than human morality evolves. Ancient people observed smaller versions of this process repeatedly. Perhaps that is why their myths sound less like fantasy and more like warnings. Because beneath the supernatural imagery lies a deeply realistic observation. Human wisdom develops more slowly than human power. And nowhere is that fear more visible than in descriptions of divine weapons. Ancient texts rarely glorify them. That is important. The weapons of the gods are not portrayed as exciting tools of conquest. They are terrifying, uncontrollable. Even gods hesitate before using them. In the Mahabharata, warriors are repeatedly warned never to unleash certain astras except under absolute necessity. One weapon is described as capable of destroying entire populations and poisoning future generations. Another cannot be recalled once activated. The texts emphasize restraint constantly. Similarly, Mesopotamian literature describes divine conflict as catastrophic not just for enemies, but for the world itself. The land suffers, rivers suffer, ordinary people suffer. This reflects something psychologically mature. Ancient civilizations understood that large-scale war damages ecosystems, economies, and future generations long after battles end. Modern humanity learned the same lesson only after industrial warfare and nuclear weapons. Yet somehow, these themes already existed thousands of years ago. That does not prove ancient nuclear conflict, but it does suggest ancient cultures possessed a sophisticated understanding of civilizational collapse. And perhaps personal memory of real disasters amplified those fears. Now consider another recurring motif: forbidden archives, hidden knowledge, sealed chambers. This appears constantly across mythology. Egyptian temple vaults, underground libraries, buried tablets, secret priesthoods guarding dangerous information. Why? Partly because ancient societies genuinely restricted specialized knowledge. Astronomy, metallurgy, mathematics, and medicine were often controlled by elites. But psychologically, hidden knowledge also represents fear. Fear that certain discoveries cannot be safely shared. And modern civilization increasingly confronts the same dilemma. Artificial intelligence researchers openly debate existential risk. Biotechnology experts worry about engineered pathogens. Military strategists discuss autonomous weapons beyond human control. For the first time in history, humanity possesses technologies capable not merely of defeating enemies, but of permanently altering civilization itself. Exactly the kind of power ancient myths warned about. This is why the Anunnaki theory resonates psychologically even among people who reject it literally. Because beneath the aliens and ancient weapons lies something emotionally true. The fear that civilization has crossed dangerous thresholds before and failed. In recent decades, anthropologists studying societal collapse identified recurring patterns shared by ancient civilizations. Environmental stress, technological overreach, resource depletion, political fragmentation, elite corruption, information breakdown. The Roman Empire experienced them. The Maya experienced them. Bronze Age Mediterranean societies experienced them. Complex civilizations are not immortal. They are temporary systems requiring constant stability. Ancient myths encoded this reality symbolically through stories of divine punishment and fallen golden ages. What modern people interpret as fantasy may actually preserve compressed cultural memory, not precise history, but emotional truth transmitted through myth. And perhaps that explains why the oldest stories remain so compelling, because they speak to fears civilization still carries subconsciously. Fear of collapse, fear of losing knowledge, fear that power may exceed wisdom, fear that humanity is repeating ancient mistakes without realizing it. The most disturbing possibility is not that the Anunnaki existed. The most disturbing possibility is that the myths are metaphorically accurate, not technologically, psychologically. Perhaps every advanced civilization eventually confronts the same temptation: to pursue power faster than wisdom evolves. And perhaps every civilization tells itself the same comforting story. This time will be different. But history rarely changes human nature. Ancient Mesopotamians feared divine weapons capable of poisoning the earth. Modern humanity built them. Ancient myths warned about intelligence beyond human control. Modern humanity is creating it. Ancient stories describe civilizations destroyed by their own arrogance. Modern civilization increasingly worries about the same outcome. Whether or not the Anunnaki were real becomes almost secondary. Because the warning survives regardless, civilizations can disappear, knowledge can vanish, progress can reverse, and power without restraint eventually becomes catastrophe. Perhaps that is why ancient cultures preserved these stories so carefully, not to entertain future generations, to warn them. And maybe that warning matters now more than ever. Because for the first time since the dawn of civilization, humanity once again possesses godlike technological capability. And like the civilizations before us, we still do not fully understand ourselves. In the final part, we bring everything together: the texts, the artifacts, the geological evidence, the myths, and the unanswered questions, and confront the deeper mystery hidden beneath the legend of the Anunnaki. Were ancient people describing gods, or remembering survivors of a forgotten world? If we strip away the mythology, if we remove the dramatic language, the gods, the symbolism, the religious interpretation, what remains? Fragments. Ancient fragments scattered across thousands of years. Texts describing impossible weapons. Cities destroyed by overwhelming heat. Legends of beings descending from the sky carrying forbidden knowledge. Underground shelters built against catastrophe. Artifacts whose purpose remains uncertain. And civilizations appearing far more suddenly and intelligently than older historical models once allowed. None of these pieces alone prove the existence of the Anunnaki as literal extraterrestrials. No verified spacecraft has been discovered beneath the sands of Iraq. No functioning ancient superweapon exists in a museum vault. No academic consensus supports the idea of prehistoric alien intervention. That is important to say clearly. But skepticism alone does not erase the mystery. Because the deeper researchers investigate ancient history, the more incomplete the official narrative appears. Human civilization did not emerge as neatly as textbooks once claimed. The timeline keeps expanding backward. The sophistication of ancient engineering keeps increasing. And the myths once dismissed as primitive fantasy now appear psychologically, culturally, and sometimes technically richer than earlier generations realized. Perhaps the greatest mistake modern civilization made was assuming ancient people were intellectually inferior. They were not. They observed the world carefully. They tracked planetary motion with astonishing precision. They built structures aligned to celestial mechanics. They developed mathematics, metallurgy, medicine, and architecture under conditions modern humans would consider nearly impossible. And above all, they remembered. Ancient cultures were obsessed with preservation, not because they feared death, because they feared forgetting. That fear echoes through every major civilization. The Egyptians buried knowledge in tombs and temples. The Sumerians baked records into clay. The Indians encoded cosmology into epics. The Maya synchronized memory with astronomy. Again and again, humanity attempted to preserve warnings across generations. Warnings about cycles, collapse, power, and perhaps technologies too dangerous to survive unchanged. So, what were the Anunnaki? There are only a few realistic possibilities. The first is the mainstream explanation. The Anunnaki were mythological beings created by ancient people to explain natural forces, kingship, war, and cosmic order. The weapons of the gods were symbolic representations of storms, plague, meteors, and psychological fear. The similarities between cultures emerge naturally through shared human storytelling patterns. This explanation is rational, evidence-based, and in many ways convincing. But there is a second possibility. The myths preserve distorted memories of real events. Not alien invasions necessarily, but catastrophes so traumatic that survivors encoded them into religion. Meteor impacts, massive atmospheric explosions, volcanic winters, civilizational collapse. Over generations, witnesses transformed engineers into gods, machines into divine vehicles, and disasters into heavenly punishment. This possibility occupies an uncomfortable middle ground between mythology and history. And then there is the third possibility, the one that refuses to disappear completely. That sometime in the deep past, humanity encountered a civilization more advanced than itself. Whether extraterrestrial, terrestrial but forgotten, or descended from an earlier human epoch now lost beneath oceans and time. The details may never be fully known, but perhaps traces survived in the oldest stories humanity ever told. Stories of radiant beings, flying machines, weapons brighter than the sun, invisible death, and cities erased from the earth. The reason these stories still fascinate people today is not because everyone secretly believes in aliens. It is because the stories touch something deeper. A growing realization that modern civilization may not be as permanent as it imagines. We live surrounded by systems so complex that most people barely understand the technologies sustaining their daily lives. Electricity, satellites, artificial intelligence, global networks, nuclear arsenals. To future civilizations, if future civilizations exist, our world might appear just as incomprehensible as the world of the gods appeared to the Sumerians. And if our civilization collapsed suddenly, how much knowledge would survive after 3,000 years? A few fragments, a few symbols, ruins, stories, misunderstood devices buried beneath dust. Perhaps future archaeologists would look at the remains of our world the same way we look at ancient Mesopotamia, trying to separate mythology from memory, trying to understand technologies beyond their framework, trying to reconstruct a civilization from broken pieces. Maybe that is the true lesson hidden beneath the legend of the Anunnaki. Not that gods once ruled the earth, but that civilizations are mortal, knowledge is fragile, and history is far less complete than we want to believe. The ancient world was not silent. It was speaking constantly, through tablets, through myths, through monuments aligned to stars, through warnings encoded into stories powerful enough to survive thousands of years. And perhaps the real question is not whether the Anunnaki existed. Perhaps the real question is why nearly every ancient culture feared the same thing: that humanity could destroy itself through the misuse of knowledge. Today, we stand closer than ever to technologies once considered divine. Machines that think, weapons capable of ending civilization, genetic tools that alter life itself. For the first time in history, ancient warnings no longer sound mythological. They sound familiar. Maybe that is why these stories continue to haunt us, because somewhere deep beneath the fantasy, they reflect us, our ambitions, our fears, our future. The weapons of the Anunnaki may never be found. The truth behind the ancient texts may remain buried forever beneath desert sand and collapsed stone. But the echoes remain, In every ruined city, every vitrified wall, every forbidden archive, every story about fire descending from the heavens. And perhaps those echoes survive for a reason. Not to tell us where we came from, but to warn us where we may be going. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through the forgotten edges of ancient history, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Which theory do you believe? Ancient myth? Lost civilization? Or memories of something humanity was never supposed to witness? Thank you for staying with us tonight. And as you drift into sleep, imagine the deserts of Mesopotamia beneath a black sky filled with stars. The same stars the Sumerians watched 5,000 years ago. The same stars beneath which they carved warnings into clay for civilizations they would never see. Perhaps they believed someone, someday, would finally understand. Good night, and until our next journey into the mysteries of the ancient world, sleep well.